Welcome back to OllieKayPolitical. This is episode 5. If you have been with us for the last 4 episodes, we have talked about maps, alliances, betrayal, and the Polish spirit of freedom. But today we need to stop. We need to take a deep breath. We must step into the center of the room and confront the enduring issue that has plagued Poland's reputation for decades. I'm talking about the accusation, often repeated in Western media, often whispered in diplomatic corridors, and sometimes shouted in anger, that Poles are inherently anti-Semitic. This accusation includes the claim that we suck it in with our mother's milk, as a certain Israeli politician once famously said. This narrative is not just painful, it is arguably the greatest lie of 20th century history. Today, we are going to dismantle this lie, not with emotions, not while shouting. Instead, we will focus on objective, factual information. We are going to look at biology, history, law, and the blood spilled on Polish soil. We need to answer a fundamental question. If Poland was such a hate-filled place, why was it the home of 80% of the world's Jewry for centuries? If Poles were complicit in the Holocaust, why were we the only nation on earth where the occupiers had to institute the death penalty for giving a Jewish neighbor a glass of water? We are going to look at the darker chapters too. We will talk about the Szmalcownicy, the blackmailers. We will talk about the Kielce pogrom. We won't hide our sins, but we will put them in context. Finally, we will discuss the current situation. We will discuss the Polish viewpoint on the ongoing tragedies in Gaza and Israel. Perhaps surprisingly to some, Poland understands the cycle of occupation, resistance, and victimhood better than almost anyone else. Grab a coffee, or better yet, a strong tea. This adventure is going to be a long, difficult, but necessary journey. Paradisus Judaeorum, the lost paradise. To understand the present, we must dig into the deep past. Most Westerners think the history of Jews in Poland begins and ends with Auschwitz. This is a tragedy of education. Let's go back to the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages encompassed the 13th and 14th centuries. What was happening in Western Europe? During this time, England, France, Spain, and Germany were expelling their Jewish populations. They were blaming them for the Black Death. They were burning them at the stake. Europe was a graveyard for the Jewish people. But to the east, there was a light. In 1264, Prince Bolesław Pobożny, Bolesław the Pious, signed the Statute of Kalisz. This wasn't just tolerance. The result was a legal shield. It granted Jews protection of life, limb, and property. It criminalized the kidnapping of Jewish children. It even penalized the disturbance of Jewish cemeteries. Later, King Kazimierz Wielki, Casimir the Great, expanded these rights. He famously said he was the king of the peasants and the Jews. He opened the borders. Why? This was due to Poland's recognition of talent. We recognized that the Jewish people brought trade, literacy, and craftsmanship. While the West built walls, Poland built a bridge. By the 16th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was known in Latin as Paradisus Judaeorum, the paradise of the Jews. In Hebrew, the word for Poland is Polin. There is a legend that when the first Jews arrived, they heard a voice from heaven say, "Polin, here you shall rest." And they did. By the mid-16th century, Poland was home to nearly 80% of the world's Jewish population. We had the Council of Four Lands, a Jewish parliament that operated within the Polish state, collecting its taxes and passing its own laws. This was a state within a state, existing in harmony. And it wasn't just Jews. We must mention the Tatars, the Lipka Tatars. The Tatars were Muslims who made their home in Poland and Lithuania. They fought for Polish kings. They had their mosques standing next to Catholic churches. When the rest of Europe was fighting the Crusades, Poland was proving that multi-ethnicity works. Therefore, when someone tells you that Poland has an ancient hatred for minorities, tell them to check the dates. We provided a safe haven during a time when the rest of the world was in turmoil. The Keeper of the National Soul, Jankiel. But you don't have to take my word for it. You don't even have to look at the law books. You just have to look at the Polish soul itself, at our literature. Every nation has its Bible of patriotism. For Poland, that book is Pantadeusz by Adam Mickiewicz. It is our national epic. We read it in school, we memorize it. It defines what it means to be Polish. And who is one of the most vital, respected, and wisest characters in this entire epic? It is Jankiel. Jankiel is an old Jewish innkeeper. In any other European literature of the 19th century, think of Dickens in England, a character like him might have been a villain or a caricature. But in Poland? Mickiewicz presents Jankiel as a model of dignity. He is composed. He is honest. The Polish nobility looks up to him. They ask him for advice. They treat him not just as a neighbor, but as a moral authority. And there's one scene that brings tears to the eyes of every Polish patriot, the famous Concert of Jankiel. It is 1812. Napoleon is marching east. Hope is in the air. And Jankiel takes his dulcimer, Cymbały, and begins to play. He doesn't play Jewish folk songs. He improvises a musical history of Poland. He plays the tragedy of the Constitution of May 3rd. He plays the horror of the Targowica betrayal. And finally, he strikes the chords of the Mazurek Dąbrowskiego, the song that would become the Polish national anthem. Think about the symbolism of that. Mickiewicz, the bard of the nation, chose a Jewish man to be the keeper of the Polish national memory. It is Jankiel who reminds the Poles who they are. It is Jankiel who holds the spiritual keys to the country's resurrection. If Poland was truly a land of deep-seated genetic antisemitism, Jankiel would not exist. He would be a villain. Instead, he is a hero. He is proof that in the collective Polish mind, a Jew could be, and was, the ultimate Polish patriot. When individuals claim that we have always harbored mutual animosity, I respond, read Pantadeusz. Listen to Jankiel play. Blood Brothers. Now, let's move from the history books to the microscope. We're leaving the realm of opinion and entering the realm of biology. This is the part of the episode that usually makes the nationalists on both sides, the pure Polish nationalists and the pure Jewish separatists, extremely uncomfortable. But science isn't concerned about your ideology. It cares about the double helix. You cannot live together in the same lands, eating the same food, drinking the same water, enduring the same winters for nearly 1,000 years without mixing. It is statistically and biologically impossible. For a long time, this was just a theory, but in the last decade, high-level genetic studies have shattered the idea that Poles and Ashkenazi Jews are two completely distinct alien biological groups. Let's look at the hard data. In 2013, a groundbreaking study was published in the prestigious journal Nature Communications. It was conducted by a massive international team led by Professor Martin Richards at the University of Huddersfield, alongside researchers from the University of Minho in Portugal. They analyzed the mitochondrial DNA of Ashkenazi Jews. For those who don't know, mitochondrial DNA is passed down strictly from the mother. It traces the female line. The traditional narrative was that Jewish communities arrived in Poland from the Middle East as intact families, men and women. But this study found something that shocked the scientific community. They discovered that while the male lineages often trace back to the Levant, the Middle East, over 80% of Ashkenazi maternal lineages originated in Europe. What does this mean? It means that as Jewish men migrated north and east into Europe and eventually Poland, they married and had children with local women from the prehistoric and historic European populations, including the Slavic lands. Professor Richards himself stated that this suggests a significant conversion of local women into the Jewish community during those early centuries. Think about the implications. It means that the Jewish mothers of the legendary Ashkenazi dynasties in Poland, the grandmothers of the scientists, the rabbis, and the artists, carried the same genetic markers as the Polish women working in the fields or the courts. And it goes the other way too. Let's look at the Y chromosome, the male line. We have to talk about the R1a haplogroup. If you look at a genetic map of Europe, haplogroup R1a is the dominant marker of the Slavic people. It is the genetic signature of a Polish man. However, research led by Dr. Doron Behar, a leading geneticist formerly of the Rambam Healthcare Campus and the Technion in Israel, has shown something fascinating about the Ashkenazi Levites. The Levites are a subgroup of Jews with specific religious duties. Behar's data found that a massive chunk of Ashkenazi Levites, over 50% in some samples, carry the R1a-1a haplogroup. This is the most common Y chromosome haplogroup in Poland. Now, scientists debate the exact timing of when this marker entered the Jewish pool. Some say it came from the Middle East, others argue it entered via the Khazars or Slavs. But the fact remains, if you take a random Polish man from Warsaw and a Jewish Levite man from New York, there is a statistically significant chance they share a common male ancestor from within the last 1,000 to 1,500 years. We are not just neighbors who waved at each other across a fence. We are biologically intertwined. There were conversions, there were marriages, there were children born out of wedlock who were raised in one community or the other. Over 10 centuries, the DNA didn't just sit side by side, it braided together. So when we say Poles are anti-Semitic, or when an Israeli politician claims Poles suck hatred with their mother's milk, they are ignoring the biological reality. That Polish spirit we are so proud of, the resilience, the stubbornness, the intellect, it is partly Jewish. And the Jewish genius that the world admires, it is partly Slavic. We are blood brothers, not metaphorically, literally. And realizing this makes the tragedy of the 20th century even more heartbreaking. It wasn't just a war between different nations. In a very real, genetic sense, it was a civil war within the same extended family. The abyss, occupation, and the death penalty. This brings us to the abyss. 1939, World War II. This is the part that the West simply does not understand. I need you to listen closely, because the average person in London, Paris, or New York has an entirely different definition of the word occupation. When a French person talks about the occupation of Paris, they remember rationing, curfews, censorship, and maybe the humiliation of seeing German flags on the Eiffel Tower. It was terrible, yes. But in Poland, occupation meant biological extermination. To understand the Polish reaction to the Holocaust, you have to look at the law. Not Polish law, but the law imposed upon us by the invaders. The Germans created the general government in occupied Poland, and here they implemented a specific legal framework that existed nowhere else in occupied Europe outside of the Soviet territories. The death penalty. This is not an anecdote. This is a matter of historical record, confirmed by the Institute of National Remembrance, IPN, in Warsaw, and the German Federal Archives. On October 15, 1941, Hans Frank, the German Governor-General of occupied Poland, issued the Third Regulation concerning the limitation of residence in the general government. The text is chillingly bureaucratic. It states, "Jews who leave their assigned district without permission will be punished with death. The same punishment applies to individuals who knowingly provide shelter to such Jews." Later, the statute was expanded by SS police leader Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger to include any form of aid. This included providing even a small piece of bread to a Jew. Giving a ride in a wagon was also considered a form of aid. Even selling food to a Jew. In France or the Netherlands, if you hid a Jew, you risked imprisonment. If you were unlucky, you might end up in a concentration camp. But there was a chance of survival. In Poland, the punishment was immediate execution. And not just for you. The Germans applied the principle of Sippenhaft, collective responsibility. If you were a father and you hid a Jewish child in your barn, they wouldn't just shoot you. They would shoot your wife. They would shoot your children. They would burn your farm to the ground. The IPN's historical records document cases where entire villages were pacified, burned alive, because one family helped a Jew. Imagine that choice. Look at your children right now. Would you risk their lives to save a stranger? Be honest. Despite this terror, hundreds of thousands of Poles did exactly that. We must speak of the Ulma family from the village of Markowa. This is verified history, recently reconfirmed by the Vatican during their beatification process in 2023. Josef and Victoria Ulma. They were simple farmers. They had 6 small children. Victoria was 7 months pregnant with the 7th. For 2 years, they hid 8 members of the Goldman, Grunfeld, and Didner families in their attic. On the morning of March 24, 1944, the German police arrived. They shot the Jews first. Then, in front of the screaming children, they executed Josef and Victoria. Then, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Eilert Deacon, gave the order. Look at how the Polish pigs who hide Jews die. They shot the children. Stasia, Basia, Władzio, Franusz, Antoś, Marisha. All dead. Why? Because they broke the German law that forbade humanity. Their life was the price. And yet, look at the data. The Yad Vashem Institute in Jerusalem, the ultimate, undisputed authority on Holocaust remembrance, awards the title of righteous among the nations, to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews. According to the latest count, Yad Vashem has recognized over 7,232 Poles. That is the highest number of any nation in the world. Think about the math of that. In the one country where the penalty for helping was instant death for your entire family, we have the highest number of recognized helpers. And historians, including those from the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, estimate that for every one person recognized by Yad Vashem, there were 50 or 100 who helped anonymously. There were also individuals who voluntarily left food in the forest. These individuals did not request a medal for their actions. Alternatively, there were individuals who were murdered alongside those they attempted to save, resulting in no witnesses to share their story. So when someone accuses Poland of being a nation of bystanders or collaborators, cite the Hans Frank Decree of 1941. Cite the archives of the IPN. And inquire, what actions would you have taken if the firearm was aimed at your child's head? The mother of the Holocaust children, Irena Sendlerowa. If the Ulma family represents the heroism of the Polish countryside, we must now travel to the heart of Warsaw to meet the woman who became the mother to thousands of orphans. Her name was Irena Sendler. While the world knows Oskar Schindler, far fewer know the name of the Polish social worker who, arguably, took even greater risks. Irena was not an isolated individual. She was the head of the children's section of Żegota. This detail is crucial to understand. Żegota was the Council to Aid Jews, an arm of the Polish underground state. It was the only government organization in occupied Europe funded by the state specifically to save Jews. Think about that. While other governments were collaborating, the Polish underground was printing fake documents and funding safe houses. Irena had a permit to enter the Warsaw Ghetto as a sanitary inspector to check for typhus. The Germans were terrified of epidemics. She used their fear against them. She would walk into the ghetto, into hell on earth, wearing a Star of David armband, not because she was Jewish, but out of solidarity. And then she would do the unthinkable. She would ask mothers to give up their children. "I cannot promise you they will live," she would say, "but I can promise you that if they stay here, they will die." How did she get them out? It was an operation of staggering complexity. Some were sedated and carried out in toolboxes or potato sacks. Some were hidden under stretchers and ambulances. Some were led through the sewers or through the old courthouse on Leszno Street that straddled the ghetto wall. One baby, Elżbieta Fikowska, was smuggled out in a wooden carpenter's box at the age of 6 months. Her only memento from her biological parents was a silver spoon tucked into the box. Once on the Aryan side, these children weren't just set free. That would be a death sentence. They had to be given new identities, new Polish names. They had to be taught Catholic prayers so they wouldn't be exposed if the Gestapo stopped them. They were hidden in convents, orphanages, and with brave Polish families. And Irena kept a record. She wrote their real Jewish names and their new Polish identities on thin strips of tissue paper. She rolled them up and buried them in glass jars under an apple tree in a friend's garden. She was determined that after the war, these children would know who they were. She was saving not just their lives, but also their history. But the Gestapo was watching. On October 20th, 1943, Irena was arrested. She was taken to Pawiak prison, a place from which few returned. They tortured her. They broke her feet and legs. They wanted the names. They wanted the locations of the leaders of Żegota. She told them nothing. She was sentenced to death. On the day of her execution, Żegota managed a miracle. They paid a massive bribe to a corrupt German guard. He let her go and marked her name on the list as executed. For the rest of the war, Irena Sendlerowa lived as a ghost. She couldn't attend her mother's funeral. She was officially dead. But she continued to coordinate the rescue of Jewish children until the very end. In total, Żegota is credited with saving thousands of Jews, and Irena's network alone is estimated to have saved 2,500 children. So when you hear that Poles were passive, remember the woman with the broken legs who buried jars of names in the garden. Remember that she acted not despite being Polish, but as an agent of the Polish state. The Traitors, Szmalcownicy, and the Underground State. We must now walk into the darkest alley of the story. We have talked about the heroes. Now we must talk about the scum. We are not here to whitewash history. We are here to own it. Because you cannot have a truthful conversation about the Holocaust in Poland without saying the word Szmalcownicy. The word comes from szmalec, lard, or szmal, slang for money. These were the blackmailers, the bounty hunters. They were Poles who would stand on the street corners of Warsaw looking for anyone who looked Jewish on the Aryan side. They would corner a terrified woman or a starving child and hiss, "Pay me, or I call the Gestapo." These people existed. They were real. And they were a nightmare for the Jews trying to survive. We do not deny this. Every society has its predators, its psychopaths, and its cowards who feed on the vulnerable. But here is where the Western narrative goes wrong. The Western narrative unfairly portrays these criminals as representative of the entire Polish nation. It suggests that Szmalcownicy were the norm. This is a lie. And we can prove it by looking at how the Polish state treated them. Unlike in France, where the Vichy police officially helped round up Jews, or in Norway, where the government collaborated, there was no Polish puppet government. There was only the Polish underground state, Polskie Państwo Podziemne. This was our legitimate government, operating in secret, loyal to the government in exile in London. And what was their policy on Szmalcownicy? On March 18, 1943, the Directorate of Civil Resistance issued an official proclamation. It stated clearly, "Every Pole who blackmails Jews or informs on them to the Germans is committing a heavy crime against the Polish nation and will be punished with death." You heard that right. Not a fine, not a reprimand, death. The underground state established special civil courts, cywilne sądy specjalne. They investigated these crimes. And the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, carried out the sentences. We have the records. We know the names. Boris, a police officer who blackmailed Jews, executed. Jan Łakiński, a notorious informer, executed. There are documented cases where Polish underground squads stormed apartments to shoot blackmailers who were tormenting Jewish families. Think about that. Poland was occupied. We were fighting for our own survival. And yet, we used our precious ammunition and risked our soldiers' lives to hunt down Poles who were hurting Jews. Why would an anti-Semitic nation do that? The truth is, the Szmalcownicy were a criminal fringe, despised by society. They were the same type of people who would loot a burning house. To equate them with the Polish population is like equating a looter with the firefighter trying to save the building. The vast, silent majority of Poles were neither heroes nor villains. They were terrified people trying to keep their children alive in a country where the penalty for everything was death. They kept their heads down. They didn't hunt Jews, but they were often too paralyzed by fear to help. That is not complicity. That is the tragedy of terror. And we must remember one more thing. Poland was the only occupied country to establish a government branch dedicated solely to saving Jews. It was called Żegota, the Council to Aid Jews. It was funded by the Polish government in London. It forged tens of thousands of identity documents. It hid thousands of children in convents and orphanages. So, when we talk about the Polish complicity, let's be super verbal about the facts. The traitors hunted Jews for money. The state hunted the traitors for justice. And the nation bled to save what it could. The Burning Barn, the tragedy of Jedwabne. If we are going to be honest, brutally honest, we cannot stop at the individual blackmailers in Warsaw. We have to travel to the northeast of Poland, to a small town called Jedwabne. If there is one word that burns in the Polish conscience more than any other, it is this one. On July 10th, 1941, shortly after the Germans took the area from the Soviets, a massacre occurred. The Jewish inhabitants of Jedwabne were rounded up, beaten, and forced into a barn. The barn was then set on fire. Hundreds of people, men, women, and children, were burned alive. For decades, the narrative was that the Nazis did these acts alone. The Gestapo came, killed the Jews, and left. But we now know the truth is much more painful. Historians from the Institute of National Remembrance, IPN, conducted a massive investigation in the early 2000s. They exhumed the bodies. They interviewed the witnesses. And the conclusion was shattering. Undoubtedly, the Germans inspired the crime. The Nazi Ordnungspolizei and Sicherheitspolizei were present. They gave the orders. They instigated the hate, using the Jews' alleged collaboration with the Soviets as a pretext. But the hands that forced the Jews into that barn, the hands that guarded them, and the hands that may have lit the fire, belonged to Poles, neighbors. These were people who had lived side by side with these victims for generations. Some historians, like Jan T. Gross, argue the Poles acted alone. Others argue they were coerced by German terror. But the IPN's final conclusion is the one we must accept. The crime was German-inspired, but it was carried out with the active participation of the Polish civilian population. There is no state excuse here. There were no special courts in Jedwabne to stop them. The result was mob violence in its rawest, ugliest form. Why do we include this? Why not hide it? You cannot claim the glory of the Ulma family if you are unwilling to own the shame of Jedwabne. You cannot celebrate the heroes who died saving Jews if you lie about the villains who helped kill them. A strong nation is not one that has a perfect history. A strong nation is one that can look at a burning barn in 1941, admit, we did this too, and then spend the next 80 years ensuring it never, ever happens again. The Kielce Pogrom, a communist trap. We moved to 1946. The war is officially over. The Germans are gone. But in Poland, the nightmare hasn't ended. It has simply changed management. We now reach the most infamous event in post-war Polish history, the Kielce Pogrom. If you open a history book in the West, it will tell you a simple story. On July 4th, 1946, hateful Polish anti-Semites attacked a building housing Holocaust survivors at 7 Planty Street, killing 37 of them. The narrative is, see, even after Auschwitz, the Poles couldn't wait to kill Jews. We must look this tragedy in the eye. We must own the fact that Polish hands held the stones. We cannot and we will not whitewash the fact that ordinary people, blinded by rumors and mob mentality, took part in this horror. That is our national shame. But history is rarely as simple as a mob. When you look at the IPN, Institute of National Remembrance, files, and the declassified documents from the era, a much more sinister picture emerges. This does not look like a spontaneous explosion of hatred. It looks like a textbook Soviet intelligence operation. Let's look at the facts. The riot started because of a rumor. A 9-year-old boy, Henio Blaszczyk, disappeared for 2 days. When he returned, he claimed he had been kidnapped and held in the basement of the Jewish Committee building. Here is the first problem. The building at 7 Planty Street did not have a basement. The boy later admitted he had been coached. Who coached him? Who told him to point the finger at the Jews? We must look at who stood to gain. In 1946, Poland was on the brink. The communists were struggling to seize total power. They faced strong opposition from the Polish Peasant Party, PSL, and the anti-communist underground. The West was watching, deciding whether to recognize the new government. The communists needed a narrative. They needed to show the world 2 things: that the anti-communist opposition were fascists and anti-Semites, that the Polish people were a chaotic, backward mob that needed the iron fist of the Soviet Union to keep order. And so, the trap was sprung. Witnesses testified that the Citizens' Militia, MO, the Communist Police, and the Security Office, UB, were present from the very beginning. Instead of dispersing the crowd, they disarmed the Jewish defenders. They confiscated the Jews' legally held weapons. Then, uniformed officers, not just the mob, fired the first shots. And here is the most bitter irony, the point you mentioned that we need to own. The communist security apparatus in Poland was a mix of Soviet agents and radicalized Poles. It is a historical fact that within the ranks of the Communist Party and the UB, there were officers of Jewish origin who had turned their backs on their own people and religion in favor of the Stalinist ideology. These communist apparatchiks cynically sacrificed the lives of Jewish survivors, people who had just escaped the gas chambers, to achieve a political goal. They let the blood flow for hours before sending in troops to restore order. Why? Because the photos of dead Jews on Polish streets were worth more to Stalin than the lives of the survivors. Those photos went around the world. They successfully branded Poland as a land of incurable antisemitism. They discredited the anti-communist opposition. And they gave the Soviet Union the excuse it needed to tighten its grip on our country, posing as the protector of minorities against Polish fascism. It was a geopolitical checkmate written in blood. So yes, we mourn the victims of Kielce. We apologize for the blindness of the mob. But we refuse to accept the narrative that this was an expression of the Polish soul. It was the only such event in post-war Poland, provoked by a regime that hated free Poland as much as it hated Zionism. Gaza, Israel, and the view from Warsaw. And that brings us to the present day, the 21st century. If you walk through Warsaw or Krakow today, you won't find the Jew-hating country described in foreign tabloids. You will find the Jewish Culture Festival in Krakow, one of the largest in the world, filled with young Poles dancing to klezmer music. You will find the Polin Museum, a world-class institution celebrating 1,000 years of shared history. The obsession with Polish anti-Semitism exists more in foreign op-eds than on Polish streets. The average Pole is neutral or even nostalgic for the time when our cultures were one. But we are also realists. And when we look at the Middle East, at the tragedy unfolding in Gaza and Israel, we see it through a very specific Polish lens. There is a misconception in the West that if you criticize the Israeli government, you must be an anti-Semite. Poland rejects this logic. Our concern for what is happening in the Gaza district does not come from hatred of Jews. It comes from our own history of being erased. We see two nations, both traumatized, both claiming the same land, and both locked in a death spiral. Let's be clear about one thing. Poland condemns the barbarism of October 7th. We must be fair and mention the massacre where over 1,000 innocent Israelis were slaughtered by Hamas. There is no context, no politics that justifies dragging families from their beds and murdering them. That is terrorism, pure and simple. And as a nation that has seen its own civilians massacred by the thousands in events like the Wola massacre or Jedwabne, we feel that pain viscerally. However, we also refuse to ignore the context. Violence and prejudice do not appear in a vacuum. They breed more violence and prejudice. As far as many in Poland are concerned, we cannot pretend history started on October 7th. We have to look back at the original sin of the region, the use of force to displace a native population. When we see images of Palestinians being forced from their homes, or when we read about the Nakba, it resonates with us in a way it might not resonate with an American or a Brit. Why? Because for 123 years, we were the Palestinians of Europe. We were a nation without a state. We were told by empires that we didn't exist. We were pushed off our lands. We fought desperate, often doomed uprisings just to prove we were still alive. So, when the Israeli government uses overwhelming military force to clear an area, arguing it is for security, a Pole looks at that and remembers when we were on the receiving end of security operations by our occupiers. We see that the initial atrocities, the displacement of Palestinians to create a state, laid the groundwork for the hatred we see today. You cannot build lasting security on the humiliation of your neighbor. This is the Polish warning to our Israeli friends. You cannot bomb your way to peace. We see the Israeli response in Gaza, which has resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, and we fear it is not solving the problem. It is manufacturing the next generation of terrorists. Just as the brutality of the German occupation created the fierce resistance of the Polish Home Army, the destruction of Gaza creates a legacy of vengeance that will last for decades. This is where the accusation of antisemitism fails. Poland's stance is not anti-Jewish. It is anti-genocide and anti-war. We believe that until both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, acknowledge the other's right to exist, this war will consume them both. We need to express our firm belief that they must discover a common ground. It sounds naive, I know, but look at Poland and Germany today. We were the bitterest enemies in human history. We inflicted millions of deaths on each other. And yet today, we are allies in NATO and the EU. If Poland and Germany can stop the cycle of hate, then surely there is hope for the Holy Land. But it starts with telling the truth about the past, admitting the sins on both sides, and putting down the gun. The verdict of history. So, after this long, difficult journey through centuries of history, genetics, and bloodshed, what is the verdict? Is Poland an anti-Semitic nation? To say yes is to ignore 1,000 years of Paradisus Judaeorum. It is to ignore the DNA evidence that proves we are cousins. It is to ignore the 7,232 trees planted in Jerusalem bearing Polish names, more than any other nation. It is to spit on the graves of the Ulma family and the thousands of others who were shot, burned, and hanged because they refused to let their neighbors die alone. But to say Poland is perfect is also a lie. It is to ignore the smoke rising from the barn in Jedwabne. It is to ignore the blackmailers on the streets of Warsaw. It is to ignore the mob in Kielce. The truth, the one the world ignores because it doesn't fit into a neat 30-second news clip, is that Poland is a nation scarred by the same fire that burned the Jews. We are not the perpetrators of the Holocaust. That guilt belongs to Germany. But we were the witnesses. And sometimes, yes, we were the flawed witnesses. However, the narrative that Poland is a land of inherent hatred is the greatest lie of the 20th century. It is a lie often used to shift blame or to paint Eastern Europe as uncivilized compared to the West. Let's be real. While the French government was packing Jews into trains, the Polish underground state was sentencing blackmailers to death. While the Americans and British were turning away Jewish refugee ships, Polish nuns were hiding Jewish children in convents. We don't ask for a medal. We just ask for the truth. We ask the world to understand that when we look at Israel and Gaza today, we don't pick sides based on prejudice. We pick the side of humanity because we know what it looks like when humanity disappears. We know that never again must mean never again for everyone. This applies not only to Jews. This applies not only to Poles, but for Palestinians, for Ukrainians, for everyone. If you take one thing away from this episode, let it be this. The Polish and Jewish souls are not enemies. They are two halves of the same tragic, beautiful history of this region. We have hurt each other, but we have saved each other more. And perhaps in that shared blood and shared pain lies the key to the future. If this episode challenged what you thought you knew about Poland, if you didn't know about the Ulma family or the death penalty decree or the genetic link, then please hit that like button and subscribe. The algorithm hates complexity. It loves stereotypes. By sharing this video, you are helping to break the algorithm and spread the truth. Send this message to your friends who think they understand Eastern Europe. Send it to anyone who repeats the anti-Semitic Poland myth without knowing the facts. And I want to hear from you in the comments. This is a heavy topic. Question of the week. Do you think the shared history and genetics between Poles and Jews can be a foundation for a new understanding? Or are the scars of the 20th century too deep to heal? Let's have a respectful debate below. Next time on OllieKayPolitical. We have spent 5 episodes talking about the enemies at the gates, the Germans, the Russians, and the betrayals of the West. Next time, we must confront the most challenging reality of all. We survived the partitions. We survived the occupation. But can we survive ourselves? Next time, we are diving into the Polish hell. We're going to dissect the duopoly, the brutal, paralyzing war between our two main political tribes that has turned neighbor against neighbor. Why are Poles so antagonized against one another? It is our local version of the Democrats versus Republicans, but fueled by history, conspiracy, and a fight for the very soul of the nation. Are we a nation of 2 tribes, or just victims of a manufactured war? Join us for Episode 6, The Duopoly, Poland's Cold Civil War. Until then, stay free, stay skeptical, and remember, united we stand, divided, well, you know the history. See you next time.